I'll be voicing over the book review for The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. James Baldwin was an American essayist. He was born in 1924 in Harlem, New York City, and he died in France in 1987. He didn't consider himself a civil rights activist. He considered himself a voice of truth, a window into the Black experience. In The Fire Next Time, the book revealed a lot of things that portrayed in his life experience. The book, in my opinion, was a manifesto of his principles of where he was at that time. So the book is broken down into two parts. The first part is entitled My Dungeon Shook, Letter to My Nephew on the 100th Anniversary of the Emancipation. And in the first part, he writes a letter to his young nephew, basically giving instructions about how to be a Black man, the responsibility of what that means, and how the world will perceive you. And he explores a lot of love dynamic in the personal sense. In the first part of the book, he talks about the relationship between his nephew and his father, who is his brother, and how it's a lineage. And then he talks about physically how they may look alike and the difference in how he will grow up. He slightly hints to than they grew up. And he talks about the relationship between the grandfather and how the grandfather viewed himself the way white people had thought of him. And then he goes into talking to his nephew about viewing himself for himself and how important that is in race relations and not in letting the environmental factors affect who he will become. And I found that interesting. The strained relationship between him and his father played a lot throughout the second part of the book. But in the first part of the book, he introduces some themes like love, religion, responsibility. He starts to hit at fire a little bit, and power and or status position. And so in the first part, he talks about love when it comes to the love of the country, the love of countrymen, which he means white people. And then he goes into religion, how holiness affects the perception of Blackness. He begins to allude to that. Responsibility, the responsibility of humans in general. He doesn't necessarily say humans, but he indicates an acceptance of self. And he doesn't clarify exactly what that means until later in the book. And then he talks about race in a way where he hints to Dr. E. Franklin Frazier, and he also talks about Charles Dickens, about the dichotomy of living in cities. How there's always two perceptions of what that city may provide, what people have set up for you, and how people live. He talks about the position of the Black man, how no matter how successful you are, that they will always let you know where you stand with them. And he goes on to bring up history element, which he brings more in the second part as well, by saying that history and accepting the true history and not inventing history will allow human beings to construct better societies. And he ends the book with a powerful quote, and I'm going to read it. You know, and I know, that the country is celebrating 100 years of freedom 100 years too soon. We cannot be free until they are free. God bless you, James, and Godspeed, your Uncle James. And so his meaning by they are free, which will be white people, he talks more about how that looks like in the second part of the book, which is down at the cross, a letter from a region in my mind. And that's the part I feel is a manifesto. And in this manifesto, he talks about his evolution in religion. He starts by detailing his Christian experience, and in his Christian experience, him doing it was following in his father's footsteps as well as being defiant of who everybody else wanted him to be. And so being holy, of course, was going in his father's footsteps. Was what they wanted him to be, but he did it through a different church. He had a different, his own way of doing it. He saw a lot of alignment with safety and religion, and he wrote in a way that was transparent to where he talked about marriage, and marriage was a protection for women as well, a soul-saving mechanism for men. And it was very interesting how he aligned the two, but he talked about love in a sense of acceptance, personal growth, and development in a way that was different than what you would expect when you first read the word. He kind of gives it its own connotation as you continue reading. And then he aligns religion with race as if they were balanced and parallel when it comes to histories. And he talks about Cain and Ham, the curse of Ham and the curse of Cain, and how the conditions of where black people was always dependent on the curse. And that's when the terminology of fire started to come up slowly and very lightly throughout the book, more so than you would think, because the title is The Fire Next Time, but his ending of the book kind of wraps it all together. And then he goes into his experience in high school with Jewish individuals and them questioning the context of the Bible made him question what exactly he believed in the ideology and why he decided to be involved in the Christian ideology. And then his relationship with the minister in the streets parallel to the relationship he wanted to garner but couldn't garner with his father, which was indicative of how he looked at the world with acceptance of the past and love. And his beginning to shy away from Christianity was because it didn't have the true sense of love of God and people as it intended to, which he states that people should love God for the love of God and not the fear of God. He goes to talk about his experience with the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X. And of course, he mentions his debate with Malcolm X and saying that he wasn't against his message, he just didn't agree with a lot of his conclusions, but he understood the principles of what Malcolm X was putting out and the Nation of Islam was putting out. And he goes back to the love element of how there was genuine love between the people in the room, which he didn't portray in the Christian part of his experience, but he saw the distinct hatred for white people. And for him, that took a lot away from the experience and their message, which he knew beforehand, but he made a conscious efforts to write about it. And He also talked about the difference between the efforts of the Christian church and the Nation of Islam, saying Elijah Muhammad has been able to do what generations of welfare workers in committees and resolutions and reports and housing projects and playgrounds have failed to do: to heal and redeem drunkards and junkies, to convert people who have come out of prison and keep them out, to make men chaste and women virtuous, and to invest both male and the female with pride and sincerity that hang about them like a unfailing light. He has done all these things which our Christian church has spectacularly failed to do. How has Elijah managed? And he goes on to talk about like the separatist movement and what that would mean and how it would look like, and he questions the Nation of Islam and how this would look like when our experience in the American black culture is so intertwined with the white American culture. And that's when he starts talking about the integration element, his um his love for white people in a sense of countrymen and toleration and understanding. And it makes sense because history tells us that he had, white lovers, he had people that he depended on, with his life, with whiteness, but he also countered that argument with white people had a fear of losing their status in American society and what that would look like. And I found it interesting how a lot of the things he was saying in the book was relevant today, with mentioning that Bobby Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1963 when the book was published, said that America will elect a black president in 40 years. And in 40 years, it will be the decade that President Barack Obama was elected. And so it was fascinating to read that and experiencing the election of President Obama, and then having an innate witnessing the innate fear of white people and their position in society. And now we have President Donald Trump in this strive to make America great again. And in the book, he has a quote to make America better. And it was almost eerie reading that, especially when he talks about the role of black people in accepting the past and not inventing a past when it comes to religion. And he ends the book by basically reiterating a lot of the things he was saying by saying, everything now we must assume is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of the prophecy that the Bible recreated in song by a slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. Thank you.